Imagine standing between two towering walls of roaring water, frozen in motion by an invisible force. The sea, once an unstoppable barrier, now parts like curtains drawn by the hand of the divine. Beneath your feet, the seabed stretches forward, damp, uneven, but miraculously passable. Behind you echoes the chaos of an approaching army. Ahead lies the hope of freedom. How did this happen? What power could command nature itself to divide? And what did it feel like to step into the heart of an impossible miracle? This is the story of one of the most dramatic rescues in recorded history, the parting of the Red Sea. More than just a biblical tale, it's a moment that shaped the destiny of a people, defined a leader, and revealed a power beyond comprehension. The Israelites had escaped slavery in Egypt, but their freedom seemed short-lived. Hemmed in by the sea and hunted by Pharaoh's elite army, they stood on the edge of annihilation. And then, the impossible happened. In this video, we journey back to that moment, through fear, faith, and the miraculous crossing that changed everything. Because sometimes, the only way forward is through the sea. Before the sea ever moved, there was pain. Centuries of slavery had hardened the Israelites' backs and broken their spirits. In Egypt, they built cities they would never inhabit, monuments that bore no memory of their names. They were the workforce of a kingdom that fed on their suffering. Their prayers rose like smoke for generations, unanswered. Until the day one man returned from exile with fire in his eyes. Moses had once lived in Pharaoh's palace. Now he came with a staff and a divine message. "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughed, then he tightened his grip. But what followed was no ordinary rebellion. 10 plagues descended on Egypt like divine wrath, each one more intense than the last. Frogs, hail, locusts, darkness, and blood. Nature turned against the empire. And finally, death itself entered the homes of the Egyptians. The firstborns perished. Pharaoh shattered, relented. The Israelites were released. The Exodus began. A human tide surged from Egypt. Men, women, children, and animals. They walked together toward a land they'd never seen but longed for deeply. The wilderness greeted them with silence. And in that silence, hope stirred. But freedom is never without fear. As they moved deeper into the desert, doubts crept in. Food was scarce, water was precious. And then came the worst news. Pharaoh had changed his mind. His army, with its war chariots and seasoned soldiers, was on their trail. The Israelites' joy turned to terror. Panic swept through the camps. Why had they left? Was this a cruel trick? To die, unarmed and helpless, in the barren wild? Yet Moses remained calm. His gaze was not on the horizon behind them, but on the promise ahead. He knew what the others didn't, that sometimes the miracle doesn't come before the danger. Sometimes you have to walk into the storm to witness deliverance. This was not just an escape, it was a transformation. A people long enslaved were now walking into the unknown, guided by pillars of fire and cloud. The journey had begun, not just to a land, but to freedom itself. And the sea, still and impassable, waited ahead. The wind stilled. The camp fell into an eerie silence. Before them stretched the vast, glistening expanse of the Red Sea. Behind them, dust clouds rose in the distance. The thunder of hooves, the creak of chariot wheels, and the war cries of soldiers grew louder by the second. The Israelites had walked into what seemed like a fatal trap. They were surrounded. On either side, steep rocky cliffs. In front, an endless body of water. Behind them, Egypt's finest warriors closed in. The same people who had only days ago sung songs of victory now turned to panic. Cries erupted. "Have you brought us out here to die?" they shouted. "It would have been better to serve Egypt than perish in the wilderness." It's easy to have faith when you're walking out of bondage, much harder when the ground disappears beneath your feet. Yes, they had been freed, but freedom doesn't always feel like safety. They had left their chains behind, only to be caught between terror and the sea. The pain of their past was chasing them. Their future was drowning in uncertainty. Yet one man stood unmoved: Moses. He raised his hands to silence the people. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." It wasn't a boast, it was belief, spoken into fear. Pharaoh, meanwhile, was confident. This was the final blow. The Israelites had nowhere to run. His army would crush them and drag the survivors back in chains. Victory seemed certain. But Pharaoh had power. The Israelites had a promise. This moment, this impossible, terrifying moment, was part of the plan. God hadn't led them astray. He had led them here, to a place where only a miracle could save them. Sometimes, deliverance doesn't show up until the last breath, the final second. When all human options are exhausted, that's when divine intervention steps in. The people stood at the edge, their backs to death, their eyes wide with dread. And yet, in that impossible place, something extraordinary was about to happen. Because God often waits until there's no other way, so that when the way opens, no one can deny who made it. The wind began to rise, not gently, but with force. A storm without rain, a roar without thunder. Tents flapped, children clutched their parents, sand spun in wild spirals as something unseen stirred the air. At the water's edge, Moses stood alone, staff lifted toward the heavens. The sea trembled. Then, it happened. A sound deep and primal tore across the shoreline, like the groaning of the earth itself. The surface of the Red Sea began to ripple violently. Waves pulled backward, defying every natural instinct. Water was not supposed to move like this. But it did. In the span of heartbeats, the sea split. A rift opened down the middle, and the water surged upward, rising in vast walls on both sides, towering, frothing, alive. The ocean stood like sentinels, frozen by divine command. The seabed, glistening and wet, emerged, but it was firm, solid enough to walk on. A gasp swept through the Israelites. Time stopped. Then Moses spoke just one word: "Go." The people surged forward. What began in shock turned into movement. Children lifted onto shoulders, animals prodded forward, carts creaking, sandals slapping against wet stone. A tide of humanity flowed into a path carved by heaven itself. Imagine it. Water, thundering above your head, held back by a force unseen. The scent of salt, the mist on your face, every step echoing off liquid walls that could collapse at any moment. And yet, they hold. They hold because God has commanded them to. It wasn't just awe, it was terror, reverence, faith. This was no illusion. The people weren't walking through an idea. They were walking through the impossible. Mothers whispered prayers with every step. Fathers scanned the horizon, torn between wonder and fear. Elders wept, remembering Egypt and never imagining they'd see this day. The youngest walked with wide eyes, too young to fully grasp the danger, but old enough to remember the fear of captivity. Behind them, Pharaoh's fury burned. His army reached the sea's edge, stunned by what they saw. But vengeance clouded reason. He gave the order: charge. The chariots rolled in. Hooves pounded the seabed, iron wheels carved into the path. What was once a sacred miracle was now a battleground. The Israelites heard the chaos growing behind them. They quickened their pace. Some stumbled, some cried out. Still they pressed on. God was not done. Suddenly, confusion gripped the Egyptian army. Wheels jammed, horses bucked. The path that had opened in perfection now began to fight back. The soldiers looked around, water quivering, walls rumbling. Something was about to change. And then it did. The last Israelite stepped onto the far shore. Safe? Delivered? Moses turned. He raised his staff once more and brought it down. The walls collapsed. With a roar greater than any storm, the waters thundered back into place. The sea swallowed the army whole. Every chariot, every sword, every trace of pursuit. In seconds, the might of Egypt was erased. Silence fell. Not fear, not dread, awe. The Israelites stood on the far bank, breathless. They had just walked through a grave and emerged alive. The sea returned to its calm surface, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. They didn't just escape slavery. They crossed into identity. They had witnessed the power of their God. Not just in plagues or promises, but in presence. Tangible, terrifying, tender. This wasn't just a path. It was a miracle with a message. When there is no way, God makes one. Each step through the parted sea was more than a movement forward. It was a declaration of trust. With every footprint pressed into the muddy seabed, the Israelites affirmed something deeper than words. We will follow, even when the way makes no sense. There were no road signs, no assurance of how long the water would hold. To their left and right, walls of water loomed, roaring, heaving, but impossibly still. Above them, the sky. Below them, the bed of an ocean they were never meant to cross. It was faith, raw, trembling, and real, that carried them forward. They didn't move in silence. Fear clung to them like mist. Children cried, elders stumbled, oxen groaned under the weight of carts. Some prayed aloud, their voices lost in the wind. Others kept their eyes fixed on Moses, a lone figure far ahead, still holding his staff as if heaven itself balanced on it. But no one turned back. There's a sacredness in stepping forward when logic says, stop. That's what this crossing was. Not the march of the fearless, but the persistence of the hopeful. Their faith wasn't perfect. It shook with every echo of hoofbeats behind them. But it was enough to take one more step. In the center of the procession, families stayed close. Fathers held trembling hands. Mothers shielded infants from the mist. Friends supported the weak. Some looked back, watching the Egyptian army press into the same path, closing the distance. But others looked ahead, eyes locked on the horizon, refusing to let fear write their ending. The sea was no longer a threat. It was a paradox, a prison transformed into a passage, and that passage demanded faith in motion. Pharaoh's army was relentless. The clatter of chariots grew louder, and the thunder of horses echoed like a ticking clock. The Israelites were free in principle, but that freedom hadn't yet taken root in their reality. Every soul on that path knew one truth: if the miracle stopped, they would die. Still, they walked, and with every step, their courage grew. What began as fear became resolve. The closer they came to the far shore, the more their pace quickened. Solid ground, real, dry, unmoving, beckoned them. Some cried, some ran, some fell to their knees the moment they touched it. Behind them, the sea still stood. Before them, the promise of something new. And then, one last foot crossed. What made this journey holy wasn't just the divine intervention. It was the decision to keep moving, even when nothing made sense. Because sometimes, faith doesn't roar. It whispers, take the next step. The last Israelite stepped onto solid ground, and then the sound shifted. The sea, which had stood motionless in defiance of nature, began to groan. A low, thunderous vibration stirred the air. The towering walls of water, once held firm by divine command, started to tremble. The Israelites turned back, breath caught in their throats. Pharaoh's army was deep within the corridor, chariots slicing through mud, horses foaming with sweat. Victory was within reach. or so they believed. But then came the unraveling. Wheels snagged, horses panicked. The perfect path became chaos. Soldiers shouted in confusion. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. They had ridden into a trap. And then, Moses lifted his staff for the final time. With a shout, he brought it down, and the sea obeyed. The waters surged inward with terrifying speed, crashing together like thunder unleashed. Walls became waves, consuming everything in their path. Chariots vanished, soldiers screamed. Then all was still. The sea returned to itself, not calm, not quiet, but whole. The path was gone, the enemy gone, the danger gone. The Israelites stood in stunned silence. There were no cheers, just the sound of waves and the pounding of hearts. What they feared most had vanished before their eyes. It was not just a military defeat, it was divine judgment. More than that, it was completion, deliverance. Freedom wasn't fully real until the threat was erased. Egypt had lost its grip, not just on their bodies, but on their future. The sea hadn't just held back an army, it had sealed their past. What had pursued them was now buried. What had enslaved them was now powerless. They had passed through not just a sea, but a transformation. The collapse of the Red Sea was not just the end of a pursuit. It was the beginning of something sacred. A people no longer defined by chains, but by covenant. They were no longer victims. They were survivors, witnesses of wonder, recipients of grace. As they stood on that distant shore, wind in their hair, salt on their skin, they knew this much. God doesn't just open the way. He closes it behind you, so you'll never go back. The parting of the Red Sea wasn't just a miracle of the past, it's a message for today. When life feels impossible, when the path forward disappears and fear closes in, remember, the same God who split the sea can make a way for you. Deliverance doesn't always come early. Sometimes it comes in the final moment, so that we never forget who saved us. Faith isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. And when you feel trapped, look up. The sea may yet part. If this inspired you, like the video, share it, and subscribe for more powerful stories of faith.